Okay. So today I'm going to be sharing some highlights of my PhD dissertation. I guess I wouldn't call it officially an exit seminar, but I guess it's definitely a good summary of some highlights of my PhD dissertation, which I completed at CBCS, and as I mentioned, is currently under examination. So first of all, I couldn't start this presentation without making a public, very huge acknowledgement to my supervisors, the Professor Richard Fulla, Professor Tiffany Morrison, and Professor Salid Kark. They did an amazing job as supervisors, not only providing so much support to my professional development, but also my personal development. So they really did an amazing job as supervisors, and I'm very thankful to them. Also, some of the work that I'm going to be presenting today couldn't have been possible without a wonderful team of collaborators from across the region, anywhere from Russia and the US all the way to Singapore and China. So to all of them, thank you so much. I won't go through individual names, that because I don't think is necessarily fair, and because I think the list also is longer than the photos that I could fit into these slides. So some of these faces may be familiar to some of you. To all of them and many more, thank you so much. So I guess all PhD projects have a little bit of a personal story. And mine began quite some years ago now, to say, probably 10 years ago, 2009, back in Broome. I was working as an assistant warden. For those that may be not familiar with Australian geography, because I'm not familiar with everybody in the room. So Broome is up here in northwestern Australia, northern Western Australia. And I was there for nearly a year, and my job involved basically helping with shorebird surveys, catching shorebirds, as well as leading bird watching tours. And of course, the ongoing perennial conversation that used to go on everywhere we would go with our workmates, our colleagues, was always about shorebirds and always about identification challenges and interest in retraps and the latest in research. But of course, conservation was always a very important topic. And talking about conservation, at the time, large-scale reclamation in the Yellow Sea was very prominent. It's still very prominent, but at the time was very prominent because Simangum in South Korea had been just closed in 2007, and that was basically the talk of town in relation to what was going on with migratory shorebird conservation. And then at the same time, I started recalling that Australia had signed bilateral agreements for conserving migratory birds, including shorebirds, with countries in the region such as China, Japan, and South Korea. And that led me to start thinking about this idea of how we could potentially reconcile this idea of having a steep population decline, such as this one, which was research led by Professor Richard Fulla, published in Nature Communications. And basically what it shows is that there has been steep declines on migratory shorebirds across many species in Australia, which are very likely reflecting flyway-wide or region-wide population trends, and how they were or they respond to habitat loss, particularly around the Yellow Sea. And then looking at this graph of steep population declines, then at the same time, we were confronted with this other reality, which was, there was a pilot study that we conducted with REACH. And basically what we did was a very basic exercise back in the day before I started my PhD. And we're going to consider the most obvious agreements that conserve or help us protect these species. When did they start emerging and who has signed them? And basically what we found is that Basically, we have here the different agreements in different colors. So the Convention on Biological Diversity, Ramsar in blue, the Convention on Migratory Species, the bilateral migratory bird agreements in the region, and the total. So this is the number of entries into force. So basically, every time a country has signed an agreement, so that's what we were counting here, and that just across time. And basically, what we see is at the same time, the populations have been crashing, international cooperation has been on the rise. So then the question was, how could we possibly make sense of that? So there are very real reasons for concern in relation to migratory shorebirds, because we are not talking about just declines. We are talking about the imminent possibility of extinction. And that's the reality we are confronted with. And an example in a cautionary tale is the case of this skimmer curlew that used to migrate in the Americas and went extinct sometime in the 1900s. And it's a species that is considered to be extinct in the wild. So this is a cautionary tale for migratory shorebirds. And then what is very interesting then is to start thinking about how migratory shorebird really can help us or can actually be taken as a study system, whereby by studying shorebirds, we are able to also relate to many other migratory species across taxa and many other migratory systems in relation to the combined migration of particular populations and the sets of institutional arrangements of governance systems in place for their conservation and management. So just as a quick example, the case of monarch butterflies across North America, the case of anadromous fish, so salmon across the Northern Pacific, sea turtles, ungulates, the case of lesser known species, such as the case of the white-eared knobcop, that migrates between Ethiopia and South Sudan. Cetaceans, such as whales, the case of bats. But of course, birds is probably the group of across all these various animals where migration is so prominent and the proportion of species is very high, and the number of species that undertake long distance migration and migrations is very high. And basically all these species at the end of the day are more or less sharing the same strategy in relation to how they complete their life cycle. And basically there is a separation, spatially and temporally, more or less across discrete both times and space between breeding and non-breeding events, basically. So basically, these species are completing their life cycle more or less cyclically between these discrete areas where breeding happens and where non-breeding happens. And that's, again, something that is shared across all taxonomic groups. But then these species are facing multiple threats. And some of those threats, something that is very important to emphasize, is that those threats are operating in many cases as a result of the multiple countries through which they complete their life cycle. And that means that not all threats may be operating across those countries. But precisely because there are so many countries, that means that the species may be facing at least one of those threats at any given time, just because of the nature of their long distance movements. So they also face indirect mortality, anything from wind turbines to actual commercial fisheries. They also subject to barriers. And this is not just to say that that happens in the terrestrial realm, also happens in the aquatic realm, in the case of dams for migratory fish, habitat loss in various ways and driven by different reasons. But yet, despite all these declines, what is very important is to recognize how important are migratory species to humans. So some species that are highly valued economically, such as tunas, are actually migratory, and species that have been declining steeply. Other species have non-consumptive values, such as the case of migratory ungulates. The case of wildebeest in Eastern Africa is a very good case of how this migration underpins a very large industry of ecotourism in the region. The case of salmon here where I am in the Pacific Northwest is a very important case of nutrient cycling as a mechanism of ecosystem service provision. The case of the fertilization, basically the carcasses of all these fish upon their return from the ocean are actually fertilizing these forests around the Pacific Northwest. And lastly, but not less importantly, the case of the cultural value of this species, precisely because our connection to this species has been going on for millennia in many cases, such as the case of salmon. It's very important that we highlight how that connection has actually become embedded in cultural symbols. And this is the case at the bottom, the case of Bartel Godwit in Western Alaska, and this is a ceremonial mask from Native Americans that actually depict migratory shorebirds. So in this particular case, Bartel Godwit. So then it's very clear then that migratory species require international agreements for the conservation, and there are various reasons. One of them is that they are a shared resource. The other one is that there is more and more, there is a recognized importance across borders of their conservation. But then any conservation in an international context, then is not going to happen in a vacuum. And it's very important that we draw parallels and trying to understand how we humans work together. In the case of countries, the political systems are more or less hierarchical and more or less nested, and that facilitates a lot collective action and decision making. But by contrast, the international system is actually characterized by the lack of that hierarchy. And that's what international relations scholars refer to as anarchy. Anarchy not as chaos, but as lack of that level of hierarchy. And basically in theory, everybody basically is at the same level. And that posits lots of challenges for advancing collective action goals. And that means that countries sometimes may engage with one another in order to pursue their own individual goals in violent manners, resulting in wars. But at the same time, and more recently, with the increased interactions between countries, particularly in relation to trade, countries have become aware that probably cooperating and collaborating with one another and using diplomacy instead of war to work out differences probably is way better and more advantageous than engaging in wars. And this is where we are situated now in relation to environmental governance. And that's precisely the reason why since the 1980s, environmental governance has become a very, very active subject of study within international relations and within political science, precisely because it's against all the theory that tells us that basically countries are not willing to cooperate with one another, but actually to work together. And it's a very intensive area of research and a very intensive area of actual activity, politically speaking. But then what do I mean by governance in institutions? And I guess by governance, I mean in this particular case, I mean the collective of mechanisms that societies use to steer collective action, to steer society towards desirable outcomes and away from undesirable outcomes. And by institutions, I mean the human-devised constraints that is structured human interactions in any particular case, and that result in repetition, that result in pattern behavior, and that result in expectations between humans at various scales, anywhere from individuals to various levels of organization, all the way up to the international system. So basically country to country. And institutional arrangements is how I operationalize the understanding of institutions, empirically speaking. So basically, I almost consider the case of treaties, what we call treaties, conventions, international agreements as institutional arrangements, but I cast the net wider than that to include other agreements that may have been signed by non-state actors that are equally important, but that we don't usually refer to specifically as treaties or conventions simply because technically they aren't, but nevertheless they are institutional arrangements. So now migratory shorebirds, for those of you who are not very familiar with this particular group of birds, around just over 200 species with a worldwide distribution. Those species, most species are long-distance migrants, and they breed either in the high Arctic, in the tundra, or in boggy and swampy areas in the boreal forest across both the Nearctic and Palearctic region. Then this is how we conceptualize the movement and the migratory cycle or life cycle of these species. More or less, they are more or less discretely contained within or separated within regions. So the case of the Americas, so with the species primarily breeding up north and then migrating south. Then the case of Eurasia and Africa, Central Asia, and then where we are in the case of Australia, the Asia Pacific region. And interesting enough, conservation has been going on for some time now in each of those regions, and they have become the epicenter of development of international agreements or institutional arrangements for advancing the conservation of this group of birds, as well as many other water birds and beyond that. So now here's where we are. So the so-called East Asian Australasian flyway. This is just a very, just a sketch basically, so to speak, of what the birds are doing and how they migrate and complete their life cycle, breeding in Siberia, across Siberia, in western and northern Alaska, and then migrating through, funneling through the Japanese archipelago and the Yellow Sea between Northeast China and the Korean Peninsula, and then spending the non-breeding season anyway from Southeast Asia all the way across to Australasia. And this is just to show you an example of one of the subspecies of barred godwit that undertakes a long-distance migration between New Zealand, the Yellow Sea, and then breeding in Western Alaska and coming back. That very same subspecies also migrates to Eastern Australia. And then what is very important is to recognize the importance of the Yellow Sea to migratory shorebirds. This is a stopover area where birds congregate en masse because mudflats are incredibly expansive. They are very large and birds are on migration. And this is basically a very important place where it's a hub of migration. And that means that habitat loss in this particular region is very likely or is actually having a disproportionate effect on flyway level populations or the actual populations of shorebirds. And this is work done by Nick Murray with Richard Fuller. And what they show was a loss of around 65% of the area in the last 5 decades. So you can see here on the panel on the right how natural habitats have been replaced by coastal infrastructure. And up to now, that was most of the research that has been conducted in the space of conservation of migratory shorebirds in the Asia Pacific. Most of the work has been done focusing on population trends. Most of the work has been done on understanding threats and to a lesser degree on management actions, but not much work and nothing really had been done at the scale of the entire flyway in relation to understanding political processes and governance across the entire region, considering country-to-country relations. So this led us to do the very first analysis, and this was the starting point to do anything, which was to understand whether we are talking about that the birds are declining despite the emergence of agreements. Then the first step was, well, we need to understand what agreements are we talking about? What do they look like? How many are there? Who is a participant to these agreements? And also importantly, what actors are participating and how that has changed over time, that participation. So what we discovered was that there is not a single agreement in the region, but actually 28 institutional arrangements. And this is just a network representation of the system of institutional arrangements in the region. At the top, all the nodes are representing institutional arrangements. The lower part of the graph represents actors. So the circles represent bilateral membership, so only 2 parties or only 2 members or 2 actors. And the triangles are 3 or more, so basically multilateral by definition. The red color represents non-legally binding institutional arrangements, and the black ones represent legally binding institutional arrangements. So what we see is that what we are capturing here is any institutional arrangement that straddles across national borders, regardless of whether the actors that are participants are actual national governments or not. So what we can see here, the blue nodes are actually representing mostly those actors that we consider to be, the classical actors in the international system, which is the nation state. So basically countries entering international agreements with one another. But not only those actors have been entering agreements. We also have NGOs that have entered agreements, straddling national borders. And at the subnational level, interestingly and very similarly to what has been observed in climate change governance, we have participation of local government. So the case of Brisbane City Council with an agreement signed with Narashino in Japan for the conservation of wetlands, sister sites. So those type of agreements is what we are talking about. Very little participation of non-state actors at that level, at the subnational level. And then supranational, by definition, they are going to be non-state actors. And we see as well a strong participation of non-state actors at the supranational level. So the 3 levels of governance having participated. The squares are representing state actors, and the diamonds are representing non-state actors. And here I have just included some logos of some of those nodes that are representing institutional arrangements. At the top, this one is the East Asian Australasian Flyway Partnership, just to provide an example. And this is a photo here of the trilateral meeting that brings together Japan, Russia, and the US for for 3 bilateral agreements that have been signed between those 3 countries. So interesting enough, and to talk about the complexity of politics in the region, even though these 3 countries have signed bilateral agreements, and that has been going on since the 70s, they are still having those bilateral agreements individually, and they haven't become trilateral, legally speaking. They have trilateralized them through meetings, but the reporting and the legal standing is still bilateral between each of those dyads of countries. So now when we look at the entire region, which involves 22 countries, what we see is that every single country but Taiwan, which for reasons that I would be happy to discuss at the end, is not included on the map. Taiwan is the only region, the only country that has not entered any international agreements due to the One China policy. Otherwise, all countries have signed at least one agreement. And what we can see here with the very pale color is that Russia and China are the countries that have entered the most agreements. And that's followed by Australia, Japan, South Korea, in the US, which is here only represented by Alaska. And then interestingly, all this region across Southeast Asia is a region where the participation is the weakest. So now when we look at how the various actors have been becoming participants of this system of international rules, then what we see is the system started emerging. So this is accession, so the actual number of times that any given member of any given party or actor has entered any of these agreements. We see that the whole system started emerging back in early 1970s, which coincides with the Stockholm meeting. And then basically has been growing steadily, with a couple of times where around the 1990s and around the early 2000s where it kind of slowed down. But up to now, we see no signals of slowing down. After we stopped collecting data, North Korea entered the Ramsar Convention and the East Asian Australasian Flyway Partnership. So interest and willingness from various actors, including national actors, to continue being active participant and entering agreements continues to happen. There is no signal of slowing down. In the case of non-state actors, they started emerging around the early 2000s to mid-2000s, and that coincides with the World Sustainable Development Summit in Johannesburg in 2002, which gave a huge boost to the development of this type of novel agreements in the international system, where it's not only the participation of the nation state understood as the actual countries entering agreement, but also a huge participation of the NGO sector and other levels of government. So now when we consider that whole architecture, that whole system of rules that I just showed you, that network, that was the whole, what we call the whole architecture, the whole system of rules. And those agreements have provisions for addressing different threats and for achieving different goals within the conservation agenda of migratory shorebirds. But when we start separating them out, we can actually have disentangle the subsystem or subset of those agreements or those institutional arrangements that are specifically designed or that have provisions for designating habitat for conservation in relation to or that are relevant to shorebirds, so primarily wetlands, in the case of agreements that have provisions for hunting management. And basically what we found is that all this participation of non-state actors, subnational level actors such as city government, and small NGOs, all that participation is very visible in that whole architecture that we saw at the beginning. And that more or less that pattern is reflected in the habitat designation system. But then when we go to hunting management, what is very striking is that that participation is dropped altogether. And the only actors at the table signing agreements with relevance to hunting management are countries. Countries are the only ones signing agreements. NGOs aren't, supranational actors aren't, subnational actors at the government level, such as city governments, aren't entering agreements for hunting management. So now what is the take-home message of this first piece of work? Is that a governance framework relevant for conserving migratory shorebirds has emerged in the Asia Pacific, that non-state actors have become active participants without a decline of state actor participation. So the theory tells us that non-state actors enter to fill sometimes the void or the gap left by the retreat of the nation state, something that has been very clear, for instance, in climate change governance in the US, particularly during the current administration, the stepping up of all the other actors beyond the nation state to fill the void left by that retreat of the nation state. That's not what we are observing here. We're observing here that the nation state continues to participate and the non-state actors are just coming to the table as a complement to supplement that, but it's not to fill a void left by retreat from the other actors. And last, non-state actors have become participants in relation to habitat conservation, but not to hunting. So then this led us to a second very important thing, which was, well, if we are to understand threats to migratory shorebirds, we need to probably start thinking beyond habitat loss. And one of those very obvious candidate threats was hunting. So we aim to answer two questions. What is the current state of knowledge of hunting? And does hunting have the potential to explain some of the population declines that we have observed? And these are just some comments, some quotes from people from across the flyway. It was just a set, and this is just a selection. Some of them are managers from local reserves. Some of them may be biologists. And one of the quotes, for instance, says, "Shorebirds are not practically harvested here. I suggest a few thousands may be shot at most annually." Second, sometimes hunters take large waders or medium-sized waders forming flocks or congregations at autumn migration here. In general, hunting appears not to be of much effect for migratory and breeding wader populations in our region now. So this is really showing a very big problem of disconnect of scales. And basically what this is signaling is that the problem of hunting had not been considered at the right spatial scale. And And then basically, this is what we were trying to do. Basically, what we were trying to do was to put that together, to assemble the jigsaw puzzle. And all what we had was this pile of loose pieces. So what we did was to put all those pieces together, and then all these ideas that hunting is not important because it only happens here and there, then it became very apparent that that's probably not the case, that hunting has actually been and is pervasive across the region. So we found that 46 species of the 61 that migrate throughout the region have been hunted since the 1970s across 14 countries and involving 165 geographic reference. The different colors are reflecting how current the records are, and for 5 countries, hunting records are very, very recent. And we know now from follow-up work after this publication came out that hunting is still happening in places such as Kamchatka. And of course, this is just something that has been going on for hundreds of years, if not millennia. The case of Western Alaska, that there is a big take by indigenous people, but in many other cases, rural people living across Southeast Asia also hunting them, and even in Australia, even though those records are not as recent. So then what we did was, okay, how about we start considering whether how vulnerable these species are to hunting has changed over time. And then what we found is that we calculated the potential biological removal, which is the PBI, and that basically what it is a threshold whereby we are able to establish when hunting goes from being a source of compensatory mortality to being additive mortality and actually driving population declines. And what we see when we calculated the former PBI values, that's around the 1990s, and then more recently around the 2010s, and we compared them for a suite of species that involve 29 taxa because we consider the subspecies level. What we have is that the PBI declined for 76% of those 29 taxa. So that means that the species have become more susceptible to hunting. So even if the hunting levels are very low, there is a very high chance that it may already be going above that level of sustainable hunting, that threshold. So, and this is just to show you an example, the case of all those species that are listed either as near threatened or actually threatened in the region, and how that value has changed over time, that PBR value for sustainable hunting. So the case of bar-tailed godwit has declined by 84%, the case of great knot, 86%, and the case of spoonbill sandpiper, and this doesn't come as a surprise, over 90%. So the take-home message is that hunting is not monitored systematically across most countries, let alone coordinated internationally. So we have a patchwork basically of data that is highly anecdotal and that is not really robust enough to inform management decisions going forward. Hunting has been pervasive taxonomically, temporally, and spatially, and hunting is likely to have caused population declines, at least in the past. So now going to the last part of what I'm sharing with you today, then the question was, okay, now we understand that hunting is very likely a threat that we can almost put vis-a-vis with habitat loss to a degree. And now we have an understanding of what the system of rules look like. Now, how about we start trying to disentangle and opening up that black box and trying to understand whether we can start getting any clues about how we can start moving the needle and moving away from that idea of how is that we can make sense of those agreements emerging at the same time the populations are declining. And the social ecological fit, for many of you that I believe have worked on social ecological systems, but basically is just a measure of the degree to which the ecological processes are actually considered and are captured by governance processes. And oftentimes, and most of the approaches are spatial. So what we did was basically to get this on the left, what we have is the system of all the rules that exist in the flyway, which is what I presented at the beginning. And what we did was just to extract all those agreements that are that have provision for habitat, and that's the network at the top. And then the network at the bottom is all those agreements that are related to hunting. And then moving forward, I was very interested to look at how much of the individual range of each species in relation to the countries where they occur is actually covered by various international agreements for habitat and for hunting. And then what I did basically was just, so this is just an example here, what I have included on the left. So this is just an example of the data. So this is, for instance, Australian practical. And this is just to show you how many agreements. So these are agreements for habitat. So there are 7 agreements relevant to habitat conservation signed by Australia. And then what I did was to calculate that across all the countries for this particular species, Australian practical, which in this case is only five range states. So I did this for each species, and I calculated the average. And all what I did basically was to see the pattern of how habitat coverage compares to hunting coverage. And what we can see is that even though both threats are addressed by agreements across the entire region to a greater or lesser degree, habitat is represented by a higher number of agreements across the range of all the species in relation to hunting. But then that doesn't account for the actual movement of species across the region. And then what we did was to use the wonderful work by TAC in 2013, looking at sea level rise effects on the migratory network of shorebirds across the region. And what I did basically was to transform this network into country-to-country ties. Because this is not necessarily, this may be a straddle, this for instance are 2 nodes within Australia. And what I did this was just to pull it together. And based on that, what I was able to do was to transform this network that has an ecological perspective and to transform it into a network that could allow me to do political analysis. And then what I did was, once I had that, I was able to represent the migratory network for those 10 taxa that TAC and Collaborators considered in his work. And all these both networks are representing the template that is underneath is the network of migratory connectivity given by the movements of migratory shorebirds. And then what is overlaying it, or the thickness of the degree of each edge, is given by how thick these lines are. And basically the thicker means that the edge degree is higher, and that means that there are more agreements signed between nodes. So in the case of habitat, what I found is that the edge degree distribution tends to be higher than the edge degree distribution for the hunting network. The red edges are actually indicative of lack of agreements altogether for that particular threat. So Taiwan comes as no surprise, and that's a gap in the case of habitat. So there are no agreements between Australia and Taiwan, and of course China and Taiwan. In the case of hunting, there are 5 gaps altogether, and that includes even a species for which we know hunting is taking place in both places. And that's the case of the US, where hunting happens legally through management, and in New Zealand, where hunting happens in a way lower intensity, a way lower intensity, but nevertheless takes place illegally, sporadically. And yet these 2 countries have no agreement for dealing with hunting of migratory shorebirds. And what is very interesting that when it comes to habitat is not only that the network of migratory movements is better covered by the network of international agreements for habitat conservation, but also the fact that this network includes the East Asian Australasian Flyway Partnership, which includes as a blueprint the development of a network of sites that are important for migration of shorebirds across the region. And hunting is not only that is has a lower coverage in relation to the international agreements, it's also that there is a lack altogether of a framework equivalent to this framework in the case of hunting. So the take-home messages from this last theme is that habitat conservation is better addressed than hunting management, and that habitat conservation is primarily a matter of implementation. We know what we need to do. We know what sites we need to conserve. We just need to go and conserve them and manage them appropriately. For hunting, even if we implement what we have in place, we may still fail badly, simply because there is no overarching system for bringing the level of coordinated response that is needed for hunting management. And as a whole, across these three themes, well, we can see that international governance for conserving migratory species is challenging, but has nevertheless emerged in the case of migratory shorebirds. And this to me is a very important point to make, because people get very frustrated with migratory shorebirds, but the fact that countries have been getting together to care about these tiny birds that are so unappealing, to me is remarkable. Second, problem definition in the case of hunting has been very difficult, but steps can be taken and need to be taken to further address them. And last, institutional design in the case of hunting needs to preempt assessments of implementation. There is an obsession amongst conservation practitioners on implementation. And the reality is that if we don't scrutinize before that, and we don't assess institutional design, which in this case, I operationalize it through the concept of social ecological fit, even if we implement it fully, we could still fail. And with that, I would like to go back to that initial graph that I was showing, and what I did here. This is just conceptually, I just overlay basically what has been happening to the populations of shorebirds in the region, that they have been in a steep decline, and what has been happening to conservation efforts measured in international collaboration and cooperation. And what we see basically is that cooperation is on the rise at the same time that populations are in a steep decline. And all what I want to believe is that we are somewhere around this threshold, and that we'll be turning the corner, as it has happened for some other migratory species, such as whales. And with that, I would like to acknowledge all the various institutions that supported my work in various ways with funding and in-kind support, and many, many, many people. Thank you very much, and I'm very excited to take questions and comments.